23 formerly enslaved people from Georgia arrived at a Brooklyn refugee camp in August of 1863. On their second night there, German volunteers served them hamburgers, simple ground beef on soft rolls seasoned with salt and pepper. When they took their first bites, 17 adults and 6 children began crying uncontrollably, not from pain or sadness, but from something the volunteers had never witnessed before: the overwhelming shock of tasting food prepared with care, served with dignity, eaten as free people. Within 48 hours of that meal, the first person vanished. By Halloween, all 23 had disappeared without a trace. The police refused to investigate. The camp's records were altered, and the truth about what happened to those who cried over hamburgers would be buried under layers of legal documents, northern complicity, and a conspiracy that reached from Brooklyn's docks all the way back to the Georgia plantation. They'd risked everything to escape. Before we continue with this story, I need to ask you something. If you're drawn to the buried truths of American history, the stories that textbooks ignore, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments. Now let's go back to that summer of 1863, when 23 people learned that even in the North, freedom was more fragile than they'd ever imagined. The summer of 1863 had turned New York into a cauldron. The draft riots in July had left parts of Manhattan burned, and dozens of black New Yorkers murdered by mobs angry about conscription laws. Federal troops restored order, but hatred simmered beneath the surface. Across the East River, Brooklyn remained quieter, though tensions ran through every neighborhood like electrical current seeking ground. On Wabaut Bay's eastern shore, where Revolutionary War prisoners once died by the thousands aboard British prison ships, the Brooklyn Abolition Society maintained a refugee camp in an abandoned rope factory. Harold Grayson, a wealthy shipping merchant who'd lost his son at Antietam, funded the operation. By late August, nearly 140 formerly enslaved people sheltered there, sleeping in converted barracks, learning to read, searching for work in a city that offered freedom but little welcome. August 27th brought new arrivals, 23 people who traveled together from Georgia. They moved as one body, protective and wary, led by a woman the others called Patience. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with graying hair wrapped in faded red cloth. When Harold Grayson interviewed her for the camp registry, she provided minimal information. They'd escaped from Pritchard's Landing, a rice plantation north of Savannah. The journey had taken 7 months. They'd started as 31 people. 8 hadn't survived. The volunteers noticed immediately how this group differed from other refugees. Most arrived as individuals or small families, strangers bound only by circumstance. But these 23 acted like family, sharing everything, sleeping in adjacent bunks, speaking among themselves in Gula-inflected speech that marked them as low country people. The children were unnaturally quiet. 3 boys, 3 girls, including an infant named Hope. None played with other children in the camp. They watched everything with ancient eyes. Among the camp's volunteers was Friedrich Fogel, a young German butcher whose family had fled Prussia after the failed revolutions of 1848. Friedrich worked his uncle's shop during the day and spent evenings at the camp teaching English and helping prepare meals. 2 days after the Georgia group arrived, he suggested something special: hamburgers, a German working-class dish becoming popular in New York's immigrant neighborhoods. Ground beef mixed with onions and spices, fried and served on soft rolls. Simple food, but substantial. Harold Grayson approved the expense without hesitation. The preparation began mid-afternoon on August 29th. Friedrich and other volunteers worked at the outdoor kitchen, hand-cranking meat grinders, chopping onions, mixing spices. The beef sizzled on iron griddles, sending up fragrant smoke that carried across the compound. Refugees emerged from barracks following their noses. Volunteers set up long tables in the yard, the same tables used for every communal meal, but tonight felt different. Maybe the rich aroma, maybe the gentle weather, maybe something in the air itself, suggesting that after so much darkness, a moment of simple pleasure was possible. As sunset painted Manhattan's skyline orange and gold, the camp's residents lined up with tin plates. Friedrich served each personally a hamburger on a warm roll. Some younger volunteers had contributed extras, sliced tomatoes, pickled cucumbers, even yellow mustard. It was a feast by camp standards. Patience's group came to the line last, as if ensuring everyone else had been served first. They filed past Friedrich one by one, accepting their plates with quiet thanks. The volunteers noticed many were trembling as they took their food. Anna Miller, a German woman helping serve, whispered to Friedrich, "They look afraid it will disappear." The refugees returned to their usual spot near the eastern barracks. For a long moment, no one ate. They simply held their plates, staring at the food. Then Patience lifted her hamburger with both hands and inhaled deeply. Others followed. An older man named Solomon closed his eyes as he breathed in the scent. A woman named Esther pressed her hand to her mouth. When Patience finally took a bite, her expression transformed. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if trying to memorize every sensation. Then her face crumpled and tears began streaming down her cheeks. Within seconds, others were crying too, not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs. Young Benjamin took a bite and began wailing, not from distress, but from something that looked like joy mixed with unbearable grief. A young woman named Naomi clutched the infant Hope while pressing her hamburger to her forehead, weeping so hard she couldn't breathe. The crying spread through the entire group. Even the stoic Solomon let tears run into his gray beard as he ate. They wept and ate simultaneously, unable to stop either action. Some laughed through their tears. Others rocked as if in prayer. The intensity of their emotion was startling, almost frightening in its rawness. Friedrich and the other volunteers stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or give them space. Anna's own eyes filled with sympathetic tears. Thomas Rutherford, a free black volunteer whose parents had escaped slavery in Virginia, watched with profound understanding. He knew what this moment represented, not just food, but recognition of their humanity. The simple dignity of a warm meal, properly seasoned, served with kindness. After several minutes, the crying gradually subsided. Patience wiped her eyes and looked at her companions, saying something in Gyula that the volunteers couldn't understand, but whose tone conveyed acknowledgement and permission to feel what they were feeling. They composed themselves enough to continue eating, though tears continued slipping down many faces. When they'd finished, Patience approached Friedrich. Her face was still wet, her eyes red and swollen. She took his hand in both of hers. "We never knew food could taste like this," she said in careful English, "like we were people who deserved it." Friedrich, who'd fled political oppression himself, nodded silently. He understood. That night, the camp settled into usual rhythms. Volunteers cleaned up and banked the cooking fire. Refugees prepared for sleep. Patience group remained together, sitting in a close circle and speaking softly. Harold Grayson, making his evening rounds, paused to observe them. He later wrote in the camp log, "The Georgia arrivals showed remarkable emotion this evening. They seemed close, knit, and protective of one another." What Grayson didn't note, what perhaps he didn't see, was the man watching from shadows beyond the lamplight, a white man in a dark coat, standing motionless near the tree line. He'd been there for over an hour, watching the meal service, watching Patience's group, especially when the lamps finally dimmed. He turned and walked toward the road leading to the ferry docks. If anyone had followed him, they would have seen him meet two other men near the waterfront. The three spoke briefly, then separated into the night. 41 hours later, 7. Old Ruth disappeared. August 31st dawned humid and heavy. Ruth had been assigned to help with laundry, a pleasant task involving hanging wet clothes on lines between posts. Anna Mueller supervised, teaching the children simple songs while they worked. Ruth was quiet but attentive, carefully pinning each garment. Around mid-morning, Anna stepped away briefly to fetch more clothes pins. When she returned less than 3 minutes later, Ruth was gone. The laundry area was open on all sides, visible from multiple points. Anna called Ruth's name, thinking the girl had wandered toward the outhouse, but Ruth didn't appear. Anna checked obvious places, then began asking other refugees. No one had seen her. The girl had vanished in broad daylight from the center of a populated camp. By noon, Harold Grayson organized a systematic search. They combed through barracks, checked the rocky shoreline, searched nearby woods and marsh. They called Ruth's name until voices grew. Nothing. The girl had evaporated like morning mist. Patience, when informed, went very still. Her face became a mask. Revealing nothing, she asked a single question. Did anyone see a man, a white man, watching? Grayson assured her that volunteers maintained constant presence, that no unauthorized persons entered the camp. Patience nodded slowly, but said nothing more. She returned to her group and spoke in urgent, hushed Gyula. The others' reactions mirrored hers, a terrible stillness, as if they'd been expecting this. Friedrich went to the local police precinct to report the missing child. He returned 2 hours later, face flushed with anger and humiliation. The desk sergeant had barely looked up. Negro girls from the contraband camp probably ran off. They do that. When Friedrich insisted that a 7-year-old wouldn't simply run away, the sergeant shrugged. We don't have men to waste searching for runaways. He refused to file a report. The camp remained on high alert for 3 days, with volunteers taking turns watching through the night, but life couldn't simply stop. Gradually, the heightened vigilance relaxed. Ruth's absence became a painful mystery, mourned but unexplained. Patience's group, however, never relaxed. They moved in tight clusters now, never allowing anyone to be alone. The men took turns staying awake through the night like sentinels. When volunteers asked about this, Patience offered vague explanations about feeling unsafe. Thomas Rutherford understood what she wasn't saying directly. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, kidnappers who made sport of capturing escaped slaves. Even in northern cities, the Fugitive Slave Act remained federal law. On September 4th, Caleb vanished. He was one of the older members, perhaps 40, with a pronounced limp from an old injury. He'd been helping unload supply wagons, hard work with frequent breaks. During one such break, Caleb walked toward the tree-line, presumably to relieve himself. 5 minutes later, when the break ended, Caleb didn't return. Friedrich walked to the tree-line calling his name. He found nothing. No sign of struggle, no indication of direction. This time, Grayson didn't bother with police. Instead, he dispatched volunteers to search docks and nearby neighborhoods, inquiring at taverns whether anyone had seen a limping black man. The searches yielded nothing. Caleb had disappeared as completely as Ruth. The pattern continued with horrifying regularity. Every few days, another member of Patience's group would vanish, sometimes during the day while engaged in routine tasks. Other times someone present at evening meal would be absent by morning, their bunk undisturbed as if they'd never lain down. Men, women, even young Isaac, who was gathering firewood one moment and gone the next. By mid-September, the camp's mood had shifted from concern to fearful. Other refugees began avoiding Patience's group as if bad fortune might be contagious. Some whispered about curses. Others suggested more practical explanations. Systematic recapture by slave hunters. But how could it happen so efficiently, so cleanly without witnesses? Patience had aged visibly, her face grew gaunt, her eyes haunted. The remaining members, now fewer than 15, stayed within sight of each other every waking moment. They'd stopped participating in camp activities, stopped attending meals. Volunteers brought food to their barracks, and Patience accepted it with hollow gratitude. Thomas Rutherford took it upon himself to investigate. As a free black man with connections throughout Brooklyn's black community, he had resources white volunteers lacked. He began asking questions at Bridge Street churches and at docks where black longshoremen worked. Had anyone seen suspicious white men watching the camp? Were there rumors of slave catchers operating in the area? The responses were disturbing but vague. Yes, there were always bounty hunters in New York, especially after the draft riots. Yes, people had vanished before. Free black New Yorkers snatched off streets and never seen again. But no one could provide specifics about who was doing this or where victims were taken. On September 21st, nearly a month after their arrival, Naomi vanished during the night. The infant Hope was found in the morning, still sleeping in Naomi's bunk, wrapped carefully in a blanket, but Naomi herself was gone. The baby's presence seemed deliberately staged, proof that Naomi hadn't left voluntarily. A mother would never abandon her infant by choice. This disappearance broke something in Patience. She gathered the remaining members, now just 11 adults and 2 children, and told Harold Grayson they were leaving. He protested, arguing they were safer here than wandering the city. Patience looked at him with eyes that had seen through every comfortable delusion. "We ain't safe nowhere," she said quietly, "but at least out there we can see them coming." Before Patience could act, Thomas received a visit from Abraham Fletcher, a black steward who worked the ferry docks. Fletcher had heard Thomas was asking questions about disappearances. He had information, he said, but it was dangerous information. The 2 men met after dark in Fletcher's small room above a waterfront warehouse. Fletcher poured whiskey into chipped cups and told Thomas what he'd seen. For the past month, 3 white men had been regular presence at the docks. They dressed respectably, good coats, clean boots. Something about them set Fletcher's teeth on edge. They paid attention to who came and went, especially black people traveling alone or in small groups. Fletcher had watched them note arrivals and departures in small leather books, like merchants tallying inventory. "But here's what makes my blood cold," Fletcher said, leaning forward. "I seen them take people, not rough, not violent. They just approach someone waiting for the ferry, speak to them quietly, and then that person goes with them. Peaceful as you please. I watched it happen 3 times, never seen any of those people again." Thomas asked the obvious question. "How do they convince people to go?" Fletcher's expression darkened. "They show them papers, documents with seals and such. Same kind slave hunters use claiming someone's a fugitive. Got legal right to be returned to their owner. Most black folks see those papers. They go along peaceful because they know causing a scene just makes it worse. Might get beat, might get killed right there, and the law won't lift a finger. These men," Thomas pressed, "you know where they take people." Fletcher shook his head. "They got a wagon usually waiting on South Street. Covered freight wagon, load people inside, drive off toward the ferry. I assume Manhattan, but I don't know beyond that." He paused, "But I heard something else. There's a man up in Manhattan, runs a boarding house near 5 Points. Name's Dutton, Virgil Dutton. Word is he's got connections down south. Helps facilitate returns for bounty hunters. Provides temporary holding before they ship people back to their owners." Thomas thanked Fletcher and left, mind racing. He went immediately to Harold Grayson's house and shared what he'd learned. Grayson listened with growing horror, then made a decision. He would go to federal authorities himself, not local police, but the military. The Army still maintained order in New York after the riots, and Grayson had connections. If these men were operating a kidnapping ring undercover of the Fugitive Slave Act, federal authorities needed to be involved. But even as Grayson planned his approach, events at the camp were reaching crisis point. What Thomas and Fletcher didn't know was that the conspiracy went far deeper than bounty hunters and corrupt boarding house operators. The morning after Thomas's conversation with Fletcher, Patience made an unexpected request. She asked Harold Grayson for a private meeting, just the 2 of them. They met in the camp's small administrative office, a converted corner of the rope factory. Patience sat down across from Grayson and was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her refined English had slipped into something raw. "I need to tell you the truth, Mr. Grayson, about who we are, about why they're taking us." Grayson leaned forward. "I'm listening. When I told you we come from Pritchard's Landing, that was true, but I didn't tell you everything." Patience's eyes focused on something distant. Pritchard's Landing wasn't just a rice plantation. It was a breeding farm. The term made Grayson flinch. In the Deep South, particularly where the international slave trade had been illegal since 1808, some plantations had shifted their business model. Rather than working enslaved people primarily for crops, they focused on producing the next generation to be sold to expanding cotton plantations. Children were the cash crop. All 23 of us, Patience continued, voice steady but hollow. We were born at Pritchard's, grew up there. We all had value in the account books because of who our parents were, how we looked, whether we were strong, whether we were smart enough for housework or skilled labor. Master Pritchard kept detailed records. When we escaped, we didn't just steal ourselves, we stole his property he had contracts to sell. But you're in New York, Grayson said. You're free. Even the Fugitive Slave Act shouldn't. Patience cut him off with a bitter laugh. The law don't protect people who look like me. You know that, but it's worse than just slave catchers. She leaned forward, eyes boring into his. Before we left Pritchard's, we found papers in the master's office. We couldn't read most of it, but Solomon could read some, enough to understand. Pritchard had agreements with men up north, businessmen, investors. They provided capital for his breeding operation, and in return, they got a percentage when the stock was sold. The implications made Grayson's stomach turn. You're saying northern businessmen were invested in slavery, invested in us specifically by name, by age, by value. Those papers had names on them, New York names, Boston names. She hesitated, fear cracking through her composure. One was from Brooklyn. We couldn't read the full name clearly. Solomon said the first part looked like Gray or Grav something. We thought maybe it was a mistake, but then we got here to your camp and you were so kind and we wanted to believe. She shook her head. But then Ruth vanished and Caleb and all the others and I started thinking, what if it wasn't an accident that we ended up here? What if someone guided us here, made sure we came to this specific camp? That's absurd, Grayson said, but his voice lacked conviction. His mind raced through the timeline. He'd established the camp in June. Patience's group had escaped in January and arrived in August, 7 months on the road, and somehow they'd ended up at Wallabout Bay rather than any of the dozen other refugee facilities in the area. He'd always assumed random chance. But what if? Who else knew about these papers, he asked. Who else at Pritchard's might have known? Master's overseer Samuel Cogburn. He handled the business side, contracts and sales, and if he knew, then anyone he worked with would know too. Patience's hands tightened in her lap. Mr. Grayson, I'm not saying you're involved. I don't believe you are, but somebody connected to this camp is. Somebody's been telling those men when we're alone, what work we're assigned to, where we'll be vulnerable. How else could they take us so clean one by one without anyone seeing? Grayson wanted to reject her theory entirely, but he couldn't. The disappearances had been too efficient, too targeted, and there was another disturbing detail. Of all the refugees who'd passed through the camp that summer, only Patience's group had experienced these vanishings. Other people came and went freely. It was only the 23 from Pritchard's Landing who were being systematically erased. If what you're saying is true, Grayson said slowly, then someone would need access to camp records to know who's here and when they arrived. They'd need freedom to move in and out without attracting attention. He paused. That describes every volunteer, or it describes you, Patience said bluntly, which is why I'm taking a risk telling you this. But I'm out of choices. In 3, maybe 4 days, there won't be enough of us left to tell the story. So I'm betting my life, all our lives, that you're who you pretend to be. Before Grayson could respond, a knock sounded. Friedrich entered looking agitated. Mr. Grayson, there's a man here to see you. Says he's from the Freedmen's Bureau. Needs to speak about camp registration requirements. Grayson and Patience exchanged a loaded glance. The Freedmen's Bureau wouldn't exist until after the war's end. Whoever this man was, he wasn't a federal official. Tell him I'll be out shortly, Grayson said. Friedrich nodded and left. Patience stood. That's one of them. I'd bet everything I own. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Grayson, if you are the man I hope you are, then you need to act now because tonight they're going to try to take the rest of us. I can feel it. After Patience left, Grayson sat alone trying to organize his thoughts. Could there be truth in her accusations? He mentally reviewed his business dealings, his associates, his investments. He'd made his fortune in shipping, legitimate shipping of goods, not human beings. But he knew many of his fellow merchants had less scrupulous backgrounds. The connections between northern capital and southern slavery ran deep and dark, but actual investment in a breeding farm that went beyond complicity into active participation. Could someone in Brooklyn really be involved? And if so, how had they learned that Pritchard's property had escaped north? unless the person had been at Pritchard's Landing themselves, or had direct contact with Cogburn, the overseer. Unless the entire refugee camp had been established not as charity, but as trap, a comfortable cage designed to lure escaped slaves into false security before sending them back south. No, that was paranoia. He'd established this camp to help people, and it had helped hundreds, but that didn't mean it couldn't also serve a darker purpose for someone else. A wolf could hide among shepherds. He walked out to meet the mysterious visitor, already formulating a plan. He would listen to what this bureau official wanted, play along, give no indication he suspected anything. Meanwhile, he would send Thomas to find real federal authorities, military commanders who could intervene with force if necessary. The man waiting in the yard was unremarkable. Mid-40s, thinning brown hair, dark suit that had seen better days. He introduced himself as Charles Wexler, assistant to the regional coordinator for refugee affairs. His credentials looked legitimate, official documents with stamps and signatures. But Grayson had enough experience with fraud to recognize skilled forgery. Wexler explained that he needed to conduct a census of all camp residents, verifying names and previous residences to ensure no one was claiming free status fraudulently. Routine matter, he said, required by new federal regulations. He'd need access to the camp registry and opportunity to interview residents individually. Grayson agreed to everything, maintaining pleasant cooperation while his mind worked through implications. This was it, the mechanism by which they'd been identifying and targeting Patience's group. As Wexler settled into the office to begin his census, Grayson quietly pulled Thomas aside and gave urgent instructions. Go to Manhattan immediately. Find the federal marshal or provost marshal, someone with actual authority and troops. Bring them back to Wallabout Bay tonight. Don't trust local police. Tell them there's a kidnapping operation in progress and lives are at stake. Thomas left immediately, catching the next ferry. But even as he departed, the situation was deteriorating in ways no one had anticipated because Charles Wexler hadn't come alone. While Wexler distracted Grayson and the volunteers with paperwork, 2 other men had quietly positioned themselves near the camp's perimeter. They weren't hiding exactly, just staying out of direct line of sight, waiting for their opportunity. That opportunity came at twilight during evening meal when attention was focused on food and conversation. One of the men approached the barracks where Patience, his remaining group, had isolated themselves. He knocked politely on the door frame and called out in a friendly voice, "Got a letter here for someone named Patience Crane. Come from Georgia. Says it's urgent family business." Inside the barracks, the remaining 11 adults and 2 children froze. A letter from Georgia could only mean one thing. Someone from Pritchard's Landing had found them, but it could also be a trap. Patience looked at Solomon, positioned nearest the door. The old man's eyes were hard as stone. "Don't do it," he whispered, "ain't no letter." But then the man's voice came again with an edge. "Also got a message about a girl named Ruth. Says she's alive and waiting. Says she wants her people to come get her." That changed everything. Ruth, who'd vanished a month ago, if there was even a chance she was alive, they couldn't ignore it. Patience moved toward the door, but Solomon grabbed her arm. "It's a lie. Has to be. Maybe," Patience said quietly. "But if there's any chance," she pulled free and approached the door. Through the gap between boards, she could see the man's silhouette holding what looked like an envelope. She opened the door just enough to speak through the gap. "Show me the letter." The man stepped closer, and in the last rays of sunlight, Patience got a clear look at his face. It was a face she recognized, not from the camp, but from farther back, from Georgia, from Pritchard's Landing itself. This man had been there, had stood in the yard during inspections, had watched them with evaluating eyes as if calculating their worth. Patience breathed and tried to slam the door, but the man was faster. He wedged his boot in the gap and threw his weight against the door. Patience and Solomon pushed back, but they were weakened by weeks of stress and fear. The door flew open, knocking them backward. The man didn't enter immediately. Instead, he stepped aside and 2 more figures appeared. One was Charles Wexler. The other was someone Patience had never seen, a tall man with silver-gray hair and the bearing of authority. He looked at the huddled refugees with contempt mixed with calculation. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," the gay-haired man said in a cultured mid-Atlantic accent. "Either you come with us peacefully, we transport you to a secure location, and this whole misunderstanding gets resolved through proper legal channels, or he let the threat hang." Solomon, still on the floor, looked up with defiance. "You got no legal right to us. We're free people on free soil." The gay-haired man smiled without warmth. "According to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, any person claimed as a fugitive slave can be arrested without warrant and returned to the claimant upon proof of ownership. I have documentation from Mr. Thaddeus Pritchard of Pritchard's Landing, Georgia, identifying each of you as his legal property. I have warrants signed by a federal commissioner authorizing your arrest and return, and I have authority under federal law to use whatever force is necessary." He pulled papers from his coat, official-looking documents covered in seals and signatures. "So yes, I do have legal right now. Are you coming peacefully for a long moment?" No one moved. Then one of the younger men, Daniel, did something unexpected. He started laughing, a wild, desperate sound. "Legal right?" he gasped. "They got legal right to steal us, drag us back, work us to death, but we got no legal right to be free. That's America." His laughter died and his face hardened. "I ain't going back. You want me? You're going to have to kill me right here." Solomon nodded. "Same. Lived 64 years, most of them in chains. I'll die free or not at all." One by one, the others voiced agreement. They would not go peacefully. The gay-haired man sighed as if dealing with obstinate children. He gestured to his companions, and the three men stepped into the barracks. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. The men were there to kill. Corpses had no value, but they were experienced in subduing resistance. They carried wooden clubs and rope, and they moved with practiced coordination. The fight lasted perhaps 2 minutes. The refugees had no weapons, were outnumbered, exhausted from weeks of fear. Several tried to flee out the back, only to find 2 more men waiting outside. Benjamin, one of the young boys, darted between an attacker's legs and sprinted toward the main yard, screaming for help. Solomon fought with particular fury, wielding a wooden stool until someone clubbed him from behind. He went down, hard blood streaming from his scalp. Daniel got his hands around one attacker's throat before being beaten into unconsciousness. Patience fought like something wild, clawing and biting until someone grabbed her arms and wrenched them behind her back. Rope bit into her wrists. Through it all, gay-haired man stood in the doorway, watching without expression. When the fighting stopped and all the adults lay bound on the floor, he stepped carefully over them and crouched beside Patience. "My name is Lawrence Graverson," he said quietly, almost conversationally. "My family has financial interests in several agricultural operations in Georgia. You and your companions represent significant capital investment, capital that walked away without authorization. I'm simply here to recover my property, nothing personal." Patience spat in his face. Graverson wiped it away without anger, then stood and addressed his men. "Load them into the wagon, use the canvas covering, and do it quietly." But Benjamin had already raised the alarm. The 10-year-old had made it to the main yard where Friedrich was helping with meal preparations. He'd crashed into Friedrich, sobbing and screaming that men were taking everyone. Friedrich didn't hesitate. He grabbed the iron poker from the cooking fire and ran toward the eastern barracks, shouting for others to follow. What Friedrich found when he burst through the door would haunt him. 11 people bound like animals, several bleeding, being dragged toward a covered wagon backed up to the building's rear. The men turned at his arrival, expressions cold and professional. One pulled out a pistol. "This doesn't concern you," the man with the gun said. "Federal business authorized by law. You interfere, you're obstructing justice." Friedrich looked past him at Patience, at Solomon's unconscious form, at the others being loaded like cargo. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, but the man had credentials, documents, federal authority. Friedrich was an immigrant with no power, no standing. The smart thing would be to step aside. But Friedrich had fled Prussia precisely because he'd learned that systems could be corrupt, that laws could be unjust, that standing aside while evil operated under legal authority was itself evil. He raised the fire poker. "I don't care what papers you have, you're not taking them." The gun swung toward him. Friedrich saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Patience's eyes go wide with horror, saw his own death approaching, and then Thomas Rutherford crashed through the door behind him, followed by 4 soldiers in Union blue. "Nobody moves," Thomas shouted. He'd found a Union Army patrol in Manhattan, convinced the lieutenant that a crime was in progress, and raced back with military backup. The soldiers, who'd been dealing with civil unrest for weeks, didn't hesitate when they saw armed men threatening civilians. They drew their own weapons, and suddenly the power balance had shifted. Graverson assessed the new situation with calculating eyes. His men were outnumbered, facing military authority. He could press his legal claims, show his warrants, and possibly still prevail. The law was on his side, but military officers during wartime had considerable discretion. If these soldiers decided to hold everyone for questioning, if they brought in marshals to investigate, if this escalated into a public incident, Graverson made his decision. "Gentlemen," he said to the soldiers, voice perfectly calm, "there's been a misunderstanding. We have legal authority to recover fugitive slaves, but perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue. We'll withdraw for now and pursue this through proper channels." He gestured to his men, who reluctantly released their captives and stepped back from the wagon. The Union lieutenant, a young man from Connecticut named William H. Schricks, who'd seen slavery's ugliness at Gettysburg, looked at Graverson with open disgust. "You got 5 minutes to get off this property. After that, I start arresting people for assault, and I'll be filing a report with my commanding officer. You want to press legal claims, you do it through official channels in daylight, not with clubs and ropes in the dark." Graverson nodded curtly, then met Patience's eyes one last time. Without a word, he promised, "This isn't over." Then he and his men withdrew, disappearing into the September night. The soldiers helped untie the captives and provided basic medical attention. Friedrich sent for Anna and other volunteers who brought water and bandages and comfort. But even as the immediate crisis passed, everyone understood this was merely a reprieve, not a victory. Graveron had the law on his side. He had documents, warrants, authority. He could return anytime with more men, more legal force. Harold Grayson, who'd been trapped in conversation with Wexler during the attack, now understood the full scope of what he'd unknowingly helped facilitate. His camp, his charity, had been used as a stalking ground, but one question still burned: who had told them, who'd been feeding information about the refugees' movements, their work assignments, their vulnerabilities? Someone had betrayed them, and that someone was still here. Lieutenant Hendricks proved to be more than a temporary savior. Rather than simply filing a report and moving on, he took personal interest in the case. He'd lost friends at Gettysburg, and the sight of men using federal law to kidnap people who'd risked everything for freedom ignited something in him. He spent the following day interviewing everyone at the camp, taking detailed statements, examining what he could learn about Graverson and his operation. The problem, H. Schricks explained to Grayson, Patience, and Thomas during an afternoon meeting, is that the law doesn't care whether slavery is morally wrong. The Fugitive Slave Act says someone who escapes slavery can be returned to their owner if that owner can prove their claim. These documents, if genuine, do exactly that. But we're in New York, Friedrich protested. Slavery is illegal here. In New York, yes, but not under federal law. The act supersedes state law, one of the compromises that held the Union together before the war. The North agreed to return escaped slaves to the South. Horrible, unjust, but legal. He paused. However, there are procedures. Warrants must be properly issued. Identifications must be verified, and force cannot be used without proper authorization and oversight. What happened last night was legally questionable at best. Patience asked quietly, "Can you protect us?" H. Schricks hesitated. "I can station guards here temporarily, but I can't provide indefinite protection. My unit will be reassigned soon, and truthfully, if Graverson returns with proper federal marshals and correctly issued warrants, I won't be able to stop him legally. The best I can do is ensure due process is followed, that you have opportunity to contest the claims in court." "Contest them how?" Solomon asked. his head bandaged from the previous night's blow. "We got no money for lawyers. We got no papers proving we were born free. All we got is our word against documents that say we're property." H. Ricks had no answer to that. The law was clear and it was terrible, but while H. Ricks couldn't provide lasting legal protection, he could investigate, and what he uncovered over the next 2 days painted a disturbing picture of how deep the conspiracy ran. Working with Thomas's contacts in the black community and Friedrich's connections among German immigrants, H. Ricks pieced together the network. Graverson was indeed a businessman with significant holdings in Georgia, including partial ownership in Pritchard's Landing. But he wasn't the only northern investor. At least 5 other men, merchants, bankers, and industrialists from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, had provided capital for the breeding operation in exchange for percentages of future sales. It was, in essence, a futures market in human beings. They'd invested in people before they were born, betting on their eventual value when sold south. When Patience Group escaped, they'd represented a substantial financial loss. But more than that, they'd represented risk. If they talked about the northern investment, if they revealed names and amounts, it could destroy reputations and potentially lead to criminal charges. Even in 1863, even with the Fugitive Slave Act providing legal cover, there were lines of complicity that Northern society found difficult to stomach publicly. So, Graverson had mounted a recovery operation, but also a silencing operation. People who'd been taken from the camp hadn't all been returned to Pritchard's Landing. Some had simply disappeared. H. Ricks discovered through his investigation that at least 3 of the missing refugees had been seen briefly at Dutton's boarding house in 5 Points, and then never seen again. Dutton, when questioned by military authorities, claimed they'd been picked up by their legal owners and transported south. But he had no documentation, no records, no proof. What Hendricks suspected but couldn't prove was darker. Some of the refugees had been killed, murdered quietly, bodies disposed of in the East River or buried in unmarked graves because dead people couldn't testify. Dead people couldn't name names or describe the northern businessmen who'd profited from their enslavement. But the question that haunted everyone was, how had Graverson known exactly when Patience Group would arrive at Wabout Bay? How had he known their work assignments, their movements, their vulnerabilities? There had to be an informant inside the camp, someone who'd been feeding information from the beginning. Grayson conducted his own quiet investigation among the volunteers. He interviewed each one separately, asking about their backgrounds, their connections, their activities over the past months. Most were exactly what they appeared to be, good-hearted people trying to help. But one volunteer's story didn't quite add up. Shaw O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who'd been volunteering since the camp opened in June, had told everyone he was a dock worker from Red Hook who supported the Union cause. But when Grayson made discreet inquiries, no one at the Red Hook docks knew anyone by that name. The address O'Brien had provided didn't exist, and when Grayson reviewed the camp's records, he noticed something disturbing. O'Brien always seemed to volunteer for tasks that put him in close contact with new arrivals. Always asked detailed questions about where people had come from and where they were going. Grayson shared his suspicions with H. Ricks, who arranged for military police to quietly apprehend O'Brien for questioning. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Sean O'Brien wasn't his real name. It was Shaw Toiver, and he worked for a private investigation firm that specialized in locating fugitive slaves and runaway debtors. He'd been placed at the camp specifically to identify valuable fugitives who might pass through. Under questioning by military authorities, Toiver admitted he'd been hired by someone connected to Pritchard's Landing to watch for any refugees from that specific plantation. When Patience, his group, arrived, he'd sent word immediately. He'd then provided regular updates about their schedules, their habits, their movements. He'd created the opportunities for the kidnappings by suggesting work assignments that isolated individuals. But Toiver insisted he hadn't known the full scope of what was happening. He thought he was simply helping return legal property to its rightful owner, operating within the bounds of the Fugitive Slave Act. He claimed he'd had no knowledge of any plans to harm the refugees, no awareness of the Northern investment scheme, no understanding that this was about silencing witnesses rather than simply recovering assets. Whether Toiver's claims of ignorance were genuine or convenient, the damage was done. The camp had been compromised from the beginning. Every refugee who'd passed through had been catalogued, assessed, and potentially marked for recapture. The place that should have been sanctuary had been a trap. When Grayson learned the truth, something broke inside him. He'd built this camp with genuine intentions, funded it with his own money, dedicated himself to the cause of helping formerly enslaved people build new lives, and it had all been used against them. His charity had become a weapon. He gathered the camp's residents and volunteers that evening and confessed everything. To his betrayal, Graverson's network, the Northern investment scheme, his own unwitting complicity. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I thought I was doing good. I thought I was helping, but I made you vulnerable. I put you in danger, and for that I am profoundly sorry." Patience, sitting in the front row with her remaining people, listened without expression. When Grayson finished, she stood. "Mr. Grayson, you didn't betray us. The law betrayed us. The country betrayed us. You just learned what we knew all along, that in America, even kindness can be turned into a weapon against black folks. Even safety is an illusion." She looked around at the assembled refugees and volunteers. "We appreciated that hamburger. We appreciated the tears we cried when we tasted it. Because for one moment, just one moment, we felt like people deserved to be treated with dignity. And nobody can take that moment away from us. Not Gravenson, not the law, not the whole damn country." Her words hung in the air, a mixture of grief and defiance that captured something essential about survival under impossible conditions. "You took the moments of grace when you could find them, knowing they might be fleeting, knowing the horror might return. But you took them anyway because the alternative was to surrender entirely." Lieutenant H. Ricks gave Grayson and the camp residents 48 hours to make decisions. Graverson would almost certainly return with proper federal marshals and airtight documentation. When that happened, H. Ricks would have no legal grounds to intervene. Patience's remaining group, now down to 9 adults and 2 children after all the disappearances, needed to move, and they needed to move fast. But where could they go? Canada was the obvious answer. Across the border into a nation that had abolished slavery and didn't recognize the Fugitive Slave Act. But that meant a journey of hundreds of miles through hostile territory with limited resources and federal law actively working against them. Other northern cities offered no more protection than New York. Even in Massachusetts, even in Boston, slave catchers operated with legal impunity. Thomas Rutherford proposed an alternative. He had contacts in the abolitionist community who operated a network of safe houses. The Underground Railroad's northern terminus designed not just to help people escape the South, but to help them disappear once they reached the North. New identities, forged documents, placement with families and communities who would protect their secrets. It was risky, illegal, and far from perfect, but it was a chance. Grayson committed his remaining resources to the effort. He would personally fund the journey, provide whatever money, supplies, and connections he could access. It was the least he could do after his camp had been used as a trap. He liquidated assets, called in favors, and within 24 hours had assembled enough resources to give Patience's group a fighting chance. But there was a complication. Baby Hope, the infant who'd lost her mother Naomi, couldn't make a difficult journey through hostile territory. She needed stability, safety, consistent care, and she needed it in a way that wouldn't mark her as a fugitive. After much painful discussion, Patience made a decision that tore at her heart. Hope would be placed with a free black family in Brooklyn, people with legal standing who could raise her as their own daughter. It was the only way to give the child a chance at a normal life. The parting between Patience and Hope was nearly unbearable to witness. Patience had carried this child across 7 states, had protected her when her mother vanished, had promised to keep her safe. Now she was handing her to strangers. But as Patience pressed her forehead against Hope's tiny head, she whispered, "You're going to grow up free. You're going to grow up safe. You're going to grow up knowing you're a person who deserves good things. That's all we ever wanted. That's all any of us ever wanted." On October 1st, as autumn began settling over New York, Patience's remaining group prepared to leave Wabaut Bay. They would travel at night, moving through the Underground Railroad network, heading ultimately toward Canada. It would take weeks, maybe months. Some of them might not make it, but staying meant certain capture and return to Georgia, or worse. Harold Grayson personally saw them off, shaking hands with each person, offering quiet words of encouragement and apology. When he reached Patience, he tried to speak, but found himself unable to form words. She clasped his hand in both of hers. "You tried," she said simply. "That counts for something." They left just after midnight on October 2nd, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts. Friedrich and Anna stood watching long after they'd vanished from sight. Thomas Rutherford had gone with them. He decided that helping them reach safety was more important than his own comfort in Brooklyn. His knowledge of the roots and his connections in the black community might make the difference between survival and capture. The camp at Wallabout Bay continued operating for another 3 months before Grayson finally closed it down. The revelation of Toiver's betrayal had destroyed confidence in the facility. Other refugee camps in the city began receiving the formerly enslaved people who needed shelter. Grayson himself became more actively involved in abolitionist circles, using his wealth and connections to support more covert operations, the kind that didn't announce themselves or keep detailed records that could be exploited. Lawrence Graverson made one more attempt to recover his property. He returned to Wallabout Bay with federal marshals and proper documentation on October 5th. 3 days after Patience's group had fled. When he found them gone, he was reportedly furious. He demanded that Grayson reveal where they'd gone, threatened legal action, accused him of conspiracy to violate federal law. Grayson, with Lieutenant H. Schrick standing beside him, calmly replied that he had no idea where the refugees had gone. People came and left the camp of their own free will. He kept no records of their departures or destinations. Graverson knew he was lying, but there was nothing he could do. His property had escaped and the trail had gone cold. His financial investment was lost, and more importantly, from his perspective, the witnesses who could have exposed the Northern investment scheme were scattered and unreachable. The question of what happened to the people who had been taken before Pat's group fled was never fully answered. Some may have been returned to Georgia, sold back into slavery in violation of every moral principle. Others likely met darker fates, disappeared to protect the conspiracy, their bodies never recovered, their names never recorded. Ruth, young Caleb, Naomi, and the others joined the countless thousands who simply vanished into the machinery of America's original sin, their stories lost to history. As for Patience Crane and her remaining companions, the historical record goes silent. There are no documents tracking their movement north, no records of their arrival in Canada. This is by design. The Underground Railroad left few traces precisely to protect the people it helped. But there are hints, suggestions, fragments that perhaps tell the rest of the story. In the spring of 1864, a group of black refugees arrived in St. Catharines, Ontario, just across the border from Niagara Falls. They were led by a woman described in a church registry only as P. They settled in the community, found work, began building lives. One of the men in the group, an elder described as having seen much suffering, helped establish a school for refugee children. He was known to the community simply as Solomon. It's not proof, it's barely evidence, but it's enough to hope. The Hamburger Patience and Her companions tasted on August 29, 1008. 163 represented something more than food. It represented a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement that they were human beings deserving of dignity, care, and simple pleasure. The tears they cried were not just gratitude, but grief for all the years when such recognition had been denied. They were tears for every meal they'd eaten from troughs like animals, for every scrap they'd fought over, for every empty belly that had defined their existence under slavery. That moment of joy made what came after even more devastating, because it revealed the cruelty at the heart of the system they tried to escape. That even in freedom, even in the North, even surrounded by people who claimed to oppose slavery, they were still seen primarily as property to be recovered or threats to be eliminated. The Fugitive Slave Act remained federal law until 164, when it was finally repealed by Congress, but the attitudes that enabled it, the willingness to treat human beings as commodities, the prioritization of property rights over human rights, the complicity of Northern institutions in Southern slavery, those attitudes persisted long after the law itself was gone. They persist in different forms to this day. Harold Grayson never fully recovered from the revelation of how his charity had been exploited. He spent the rest of his life supporting abolitionist causes, but always with the haunted awareness that good intentions weren't enough, that systems of oppression could co-opt even genuine kindness. He died in 171, his fortune largely spent on causes he hoped might redeem his unwitting complicity. Friedrich Vogel returned to Germany in 1867, carrying with him the memory of that August evening when simple food had provoked such profound emotion. He never forgot the lesson that what we take for granted, seasoned meat, soft bread, dignity, and eating, can be revolutionary acts for those who have been systematically denied their humanity. The camp at Wabaut Bay was eventually torn down, replaced by industrial development as Brooklyn grew into a major city. No marker exists today to indicate that formerly enslaved people once sheltered there, that they cried with joy over hamburgers, that they fought desperately for freedom that should never have been denied them. The land has forgotten if land can forget. But remember stories like this one pieced together from fragments of records, from hints in diaries, from the silences in official histories where names should be but aren't. We tell these stories not because they have happy endings, most don't, but because they reveal truths about who we were and perhaps who we still are. Patience Crane and her companions wanted something impossibly simple: to eat good food, to live without fear, to be treated as people deserving of dignity and respect. That such basic desires required a 7-month journey through hell, required risking death, required running from legal authorities who saw them as property rather than people. That tells us everything we need to know about the nation they were trying to survive in. They cried when they tasted those hamburgers because for one moment the world treated them as if they mattered, as if their pleasure, their satisfaction, their simple joy was worth something. And in that moment they were more free than they'd ever been, even knowing, perhaps especially knowing, that the freedom might not last. That's the real horror of this story. Not the violence, not the kidnappings, not even the betrayal. Real horror is that a moment of genuine human kindness, the act of serving someone a warm meal, could be so rare, so unexpected, so overwhelming that it provoked tears. The real horror is that the system worked exactly as designed, that the law protected the oppressors and condemned the oppressed, that Northern businessmen profited from Southern slavery while claiming moral superiority. The real horror is that these weren't monsters who did these things. They were ordinary Americans operating within legal systems, pursuing profit, following incentives that their society had established. That's what makes this story truly terrifying. Not the evil of individuals, but the evil of structures that turned ordinary people into participants in atrocity. So, what do you think of this story? Do you believe everything that happened here has been consigned safely to history? Or do you see echoes of these patterns still operating today? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If stories like this, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about American history, resonate with you, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories don't get told in textbooks. They don't get commemorated with statues or plaques. They survive only if we keep telling them, keep remembering, keep asking uncomfortable questions about how we got here and where we're going. Thank you for listening, and remember, past isn't past, it's still with us, still shaping us, still demanding that we reckon with its truths. See you in the next video.